The empire is not only streets and columns, it is people, and their lives, their moments, echo deeper than marble. A teacher in Hispania reads poetry to students in a cracked courtyard. The boys repeat Horace's lines, but their eyes are on the sky, watching for smoke, for change. The teacher's voice trembles. He has taught for 30 years. He fears he may be the last. A potter near Carthage shapes clay by hand. His father once sold jars to Roman governors. Now his customers are Berber tribesmen and monks. He etches Latin into the clay, not knowing if anyone will read it. In Egypt, a Roman merchant negotiates with a caravan of Nubians. The market bustles, half in Greek, half in Coptic. Rome's language lingers, but the faces look elsewhere. The Nile no longer feeds an empire. It feeds families. In the Alps, a shepherd finds a coin in the dirt, stamped with the face of Trajan. He shows it to no one, just rubs the metal and places it beneath a rock. A private relic of something vast and vanished. A retired centurion in Illyricum, now old and blind, sings battle hymns to children who giggle and play. They do not believe his stories. He does not mind. He sings anyway. A Jewish scribe in Antioch writes letters to a contact in Rome. They speak of taxes, politics, rumors. They argue politely about whether the empire is dead. The Roman still believes. The scribe is not so sure. And in Rome itself, the twilight lingers. A mother tells her son about the glory days, how the baths were once full, how the senators once mattered. He listens, then runs off to play among broken columns. In the shadows of temples now used as churches, beggars pray. A former gladiator, now a doorman, watches crowds that once cheered him pass without recognition above them all. Vultures circle. Rome is not yet fallen, but it is falling. And the wind whispers, not in Latin, but in silence. The empire's borders stretch like vines, pulsating with tension, with beauty, with inevitable collapse. In Thessalonica, a mosaicist lays golden tiles into a church ceiling. Each flicker of light catches on the Virgin's face. He learned the craft from his father, who worked on temples of Jupiter. Now he kneels beneath a cross. He murmurs a prayer, not for God, but for Rome. In the hills near Noricum, a family hides Roman coins under floorboards, not to spend, but to remember. The father teaches his children the names of emperors, just as he once memorized them in school. His voice breaks when he says, Aurelian. In a Lusitanian vineyard, an old woman sings to the vines. Her lullaby is half in Latin, half in forgotten dialect. Her grapes grow wild now, traders seldom come, but she sings, for the gods, for the land, for the empire that once gave her family Roman names on the steps of a ruined amphitheater in Asia Minor. A drunk ex-legionary tells stories to stray dogs and tired travelers. No one listens. He laughs anyway, not because the stories are funny, but because remembering them keeps them real. In Cyrene, the temple of Apollo becomes a shelter. Wind howls through broken marble. Children sleep beneath crumbling columns. A former priest lights a fire where once he burned incense. The gods, he says, do not mind. They are gone to dot in every province. 1,000 such scenes flicker like dying torches. The glory of Rome was never a single thing. It was millions of souls breathing in unison. And now, one by one, those breaths fall silent in the chalk. Hills of Britannia, A Roman administrator rides between crumbling forts. He carries scrolls stamped with fading seals, tax records, census orders, requests for repairs. He reads them out loud to men who barely listen. The empire, on paper, still commands, but in the fields and forests, another reality reigns. In Cappadocia, a philosopher writes to his former pupil in Athens. His letter is poetic, sorrowful. He speaks of the decay of virtue, the rise of spectacle, the emptiness behind Roman pride. He ends with a question: if the soul of Rome dies in silence, who will hear it? At a garrison near the Danube, legionaries drill in the mud. Their armor is patched. Their commander is a man from Thrace, loyal to his pay more than to an empire he has never seen. They still chant Latin commands, but it is habit now, not pride. In Numidia, a Christian bishop delivers a sermon in a half-rebuilt forum. He quotes Augustine, mixes scripture with Roman metaphors. He tells his flock, the empire was always a shadow. Only the soul is eternal. Some nod, others shift uncomfortably. The old gods still live in their dreams. In a coastal town of Dalmatia, a girl scribbles graffiti into a temple wall. She writes, in rough Latin, Iulia was here, Rome was here. She laughs and runs. She does not know she's writing history. In Constantinople, a senator reads reports from the West. He frowns, sips wine, and murmurs to a colleague, let them fall. We are Rome now. But the dream of a united empire still haunts the wind. It rides with messengers. It whispers in libraries. It waits in the blood of exiles. Even now, the glory before the fall is not entirely gone. It lingers in stone, in memory, in the rusting edge of a legionnaire's forgotten sword. In Baetica, a noble family once tied to emperor's hosts, a dinner by torchlight. Their villa is worn, mosaics chipped, fountains dry, but they wear their finest togas. The paterfamilias speaks Latin with the old cadences, quoting Cicero. Outside, farmers riot over bread. His daughter asks, do they know we were once Rome? He replies, we still are. But his voice cracks. In the mountains of Thrace, a village revolts against tax collectors. Once Roman loyalists, they now burn imperial seals and chase officials into the forests. They claim no king, no Caesar, only survival. They are tired of feeding a city they will never see. In a Senate scroll room, an aged scribe copies the laws of a dead emperor. The ink is steady, the hands are practiced, but the eyes are hollow. He whispers, Lex Romana. Even as the streets outside speak Gothic and Frankish, a young poet in Mediolanum recites verses beneath the arch of Constantine. He performs for no audience, only for the marble, for the sky. He speaks of Rome's greatness, its fall, its strange new twilight. His final line, we built forever, but forgot how to stay. And somewhere, at the edge of the empire, a soldier, nameless, sleepless, stands watch on a broken wall. The stars above him are unchanged, but the world behind him is not. Rome, in its glory, sowed both marvel and madness, and now, in the golden haze of memory, it flickers still in Aquileia. A midwife delivers a child as the city trembles. Under threat, the father is absent, conscripted, or lost. The mother names the baby Julia after an ancestor who once rode in a senator's litter. She prays the child will live long enough to see peace, though she no longer knows what peace looks like. A runaway slave in Sicily returns to the ruins of his master's estate. Vines cover marble, statues lie shattered. He lights a fire in the atrium and sleeps there, unafraid. Rome once ruled his body. Now, in its ashes, he finds freedom. A doctor in Achaia tends the sick with scrolls written centuries before. Galen's words guide his hands, but his eyes are tired. His patience whisper prayers to Christ, to Asclepius, to fate. He no longer knows which god listens, but he still treats their wounds in a shrine atop a Pyrenea hill. A priest burns his last offerings to Mars. No worshippers remain. He chants the rites alone, voice cracking. As the flames die, he bows his head, not in defeat, but in reverence. Rome's gods fade, not in anger, but in silence. In the Subura district, a poet declaims to a crowd of children and beggars. His verses echo Virgil, but his rhymes are coarser, street-born. He speaks of lost glory and hungry bellies, of emperors in marble and rats in the wall. They laugh, they listen, and for a moment, Rome breathes again, not in triumph, but in memory. And as the sun sets over the Forum, casting long shadows across broken pillars, a flock of birds rises. They circled the sky, where once the eagles of legions flew. Below, the city sleeps, not in glory, but in Ghostlight. Rome is not one thing, not one time. It is many lives, many deaths, many dreams stitched into stone and song. The glory before. The fall was not a lie, it was a moment. And like all moments, it passed. Commodus, the son of a philosopher king, and the spark that begins the smoldering. His reign is cruel, theatrical. An emperor who believes he is a god and makes Rome his stage. At night, he parades through the streets dressed as Hercules. Wielding a club, he fights in the arena, not as a show of humility, but to be worshipped. The people cheer, but their eyes are wary. This is no philosopher. This is a storm in a golden robe. Corruption seeps into every office. The Praetorian Guard, once protectors, now auction emperors like property. Commodus is assassinated, but the disease he symbolized does not die with him. In the following years, emperor follows emperor, often murdered, sometimes sold, always desperate. A general in Gaul declares himself Caesar, another in Africa. Civil wars erupt like infections in a body with no immune system. In the market, denarii are lighter, the silver content thinned. A baker grumbles, it takes twice the coin to buy half the grain. A father cannot afford sandals for his sons. A soldier eyes his officer with growing resentment. Everywhere, inflation is not just economic, it's emotional. People lose trust in the coin, in the law, in the empire. The Antonine Plague returns. It spreads on the breath of travelers, on the backs of rats, in the water of the fountains. It takes young and old alike. Entire villages vanish. Priests burn incense in the streets, but the gods are silent. The funerary fires burn without pause. A widow buries her husband and 2 sons in 1 week. She does not cry. She only stares into the smoke, mouthing prayers she no longer believes. And yet, Rome goes on, shambling, wounded, proud. A senator proposes a new tax to pay the legions. Another plots his downfall. In distant Syria, a teenage general wins a battle and is hailed as the next savior of Rome. He will be dead before the year ends. The grain from Africa arrives late. The river trade from Gaul slows. Pirates infest the Mediterranean once again. Roads that once bore the footsteps of legionaries now crack untended. Bandits return to old hideouts. Travelers move in armed groups. Rome is still Rome, but the world around her is changing, and she is slow to notice. In the amphitheater, the crowds still roar. Gladiators bleed beneath bronze helmets. The mob forgets, for a moment, the rot outside, but the arena, too, shows its age. The paint flakes, the marble chips, a lion mauls a man too quickly. The crowd is silent. Even blood cannot entertain forever. And in the corners of the empire, beyond the mountains and rivers, something darker stirs. Germanic tribes whisper of weakness. Huns move in the Far East, displacing everything in their path. The empire forgets what made it strong: discipline, unity, sacrifice. In its place are pride, greed, and ghosts. In the villa of a wealthy Roman, on the Palatine Hill, guests once dined on silver platters under painted ceilings. Now the hall echoes with footsteps of servants and shadows. The master hosts fewer feasts. His once lavish library is locked, not from thieves, but from dust. He drinks alone, speaking aloud two busts of ancestors who would not recognize his Rome. In a tenement block below, a laundress scrapes coins together for lamp oil. Her husband, once a legionary, now limps through the forum, selling stale bread. They speak Latin. Magistrate in Carthage writes desperate letters to Rome. Bandits plague the roads. Tax revenues vanish. Temples crumble into homes for owls. He writes, "We are still Roman, but the gods have fled." His secretary, a Berber convert, copies the message and adds a personal note. If Rome still rules, she does so in dreams. In the eastern provinces, local governors grow bolder. A nobleman in Syria holds Roman citizenship, but wears Persian robes. He tells visitors that loyalty to Rome is a polite fiction. In his palace, Latin scrolls share shelves with texts. A hybrid world is rising. A merchant in Massilia curses the dwindling coinage. He used to trade with Egypt. Now he barely reaches Narbo. Too many tolls, too many bribes, too many thieves with badges. His cart bears the Aquila insignia, more for nostalgia than protection. On the steps of the Curia, a junior senator argues for reforms. He speaks of tightening the tax code, of reorganizing provincial troops. No one listens. They discuss villas, wine, the new bishop's latest sermon. Politics has become theater, and the actors no longer believe their lines. Commodus once pranced as Hercules, but now others adopt masks. A general in Pannonia erects statues of himself dressed as Jupiter. His troops cheer. His rivals laugh. The Senate sighs. Rome once had emperors. Now it has caricatures. An old widow in Alexandria writes her granddaughter in Gaul, "I remember when Roman ships crowded our harbor, when Latin hymns rang in churches beside Greek chants. Now the harbor is empty, and the hymns, they whisper only loss." In a mountain pass, a detachment of auxiliary troops is ambushed. No reinforcements come. The outpost falls. Its beacon. Fire lights a sky no one watches. In an alleyway behind the Pantheon, a boy carves his name beside scratched drawings of ships and lions. The temple has become a church. Its dome still towers. but its echo speaks not of Jupiter, nor of victory, but of change. In an Umbrian monastery, a former senator sweeps the stone floor. He once spoke in the Senate chamber. Now he chants psalms. In Latin, the only remnant of empire that still binds him to the world he lost. He looks out at the vineyards and says, "I lived through Rome's death. I still live." In Dacia, abandoned decades earlier, Roman roads crack beneath the hooves of local warlords. Children play with rusted helmets. Their parents speak of emperors like myths, as if Hadrian were a demigod, as if legionaries had wings. A Roman engineer in Antioch examines an aqueduct's crumbling arches. He draws diagrams, tries to train locals, but no one comes. He carves aqua Roma into the last stone he lays. The water never flows again. In a Sicilian vineyard, two men argue over land rights. One cites Roman law, the other brandishes a sword. The law loses. In the shadow of a burned villa, a child finds a broken figurine of Mercury. He does not know the name. He calls it the Fast One and keeps it in a pouch around his neck. A bishop in Tarraco preaches against pagan relics, but secretly collects them. He keeps a laurel wreath behind his altar. On stormy nights, he prays to both God and Rome. And a final scene, a library in Pergamon catches fire. Scrolls, centuries old, curl and blacken. A slave tries to save one, a record of Roman law. He fails. The ashes rise like birds in the villa of a once powerful general near Capua, now converted into a monastery. A child practices his letters on shards of broken amphory. The monks speak Latin, yes, but also the prayers of a newer world. The general, now a silent figure in a hooded robe, walks the garden paths alone. He does not mourn the wars he fought, only the flag he once fought for. A road crew in Africa patches Roman stone with mud and gravel. They lack engineers, blueprints, oversight, but they continue because it is what their fathers did. Their mothers told them the stones led to Rome. They no longer ask where they lead now. In a villa library on the outskirts of Ephesus, a young girl reads Ovid aloud to herself. The walls are damp, the scrolls decay. She does not fully understand the Latin verses, but she loves their rhythm. Outside, her brothers build a fort of old shields. Their empire is a game. Hers is a whisper. Asterisk in the ruins of Lugdunum to traveling. Minstrels sing tales of Caesar and Antony to a half-drunk audience in a smoky tavern. The patrons know the names, but not the deeds. One man mutters, "Didn't Caesar lose to the Greeks?" The other says, "He was a god, wasn't he?" History becomes legend. Legend becomes fog. A craftsman in Athens molds a statue of a saint using tools passed down from sculptors who once shaped gods. His hands remember Rome, even if his prayers no longer do. And at the edge of a crumbling aqueduct in Gaul, a farmer finds a rusted gladius. He gives it to his son, who swings it in the air and yells nonsense Latin. The boy laughs. The blade breaks at the edge of the Red Sea. In a dusty port, once crowded with Roman merchants, a fisherman repairs his net using sinew and scraps of linen. His grandfather told him tales of ships with crimson sails and bronze prows. He has never seen such things, but when he casts his line, he whispers, "Roma," as if the sea might still remember. In the hills of Gaul, a mother teaches her daughter a lullaby once sung in the villas of senators. Its Latin verses are mangled now, mixed with local tongue. But they carry a rhythm, a memory not of empire, but of the people who lived beneath its weight, at a border fort long since abandoned. Two shepherd boys chase goats through toppled columns. One finds an old standard in the dust, a faded eagle, cloth rotting, pole broken. They wave it like a toy dot in the shadows of a chapel built into a collapsed Roman bathhouse. A priest lights a candle before Mass. The stone still smells faintly of steam and sweat, as if the past had not fully washed away. He chants the liturgy. His echo answers in Latin, and the walls cracked and faded. Listen, asterisk, at a Roman bridge, still spanning a river in Pannonia. Two lovers carve their names into a brick. They do not know who built the bridge, but they kiss beneath it, as countless others once did. In a tavern in Sardinia, a bard sings of Caesar's battles and Cicero's speeches. The locals drink, laugh, shout verses with him. They are ill-remembered, half-true, romantic, but they echo. And in a clearing once called Forum Traiani, now just a pasture, a shepherd lights a fire. A child born in these days will grow to see Rome, not as eternal, but as memory. Asterisk. In the blood-red dusk before battle, as the Tiber shimmered under Rome's dying light, Constantine stared toward the Milvian bridge with a soldier's silence and a prophet's dread. And then it commenced in cloud and fire across, of light in the sky, bearing the words, "In this sign you will conquer." The next morning, Constantine rode into history with the Chiro on his standard and Christian faith in his heart, crushing Maxentus in the river's depths and claiming the Western Empire. But his victory was more than political, it was spiritual. A new god, once crucified by Rome, now entered the gates of power. No longer hiding in catacombs, Christians emerged into daylight, clinging to the hope that their faith would transform the empire, may be transformed by it. Constantine declared peace through the Edict of Milan, restoring church property and elevating bishops to imperial confidants. He commissioned churches where temples once stood and gave Christianity not just freedom, but favor. Yet the God he had embraced was not of one voice. Beneath the hymns and incense, a storm of theology brewed. In Alexandria, the priest Arius proclaimed that Christ was created, not coeternally, flame-lit by God, not equal to him. His opponents, led by the fierce and brilliant Athanasius, called this heresy, claiming Christ was begotten, not made God. From God, light from light, the empire buzzed with slogans and schisms, and mobs clashed in the name of theology. Constantine, desperate to preserve unity, summoned the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. The first ecumenical council of the Christian world. Bishops from across the empire gathered, not in fear of lions, but in the court of a Caesar. There, amid solemn chants and furious debates, the Nicene Creed was born, declaring Christ consubstantial with the Father. Arius was exiled, but unity proved fragile. Constantine, more politician than theologian, soon wavered. He recalled Arius, banished Athanasius, and sought compromise where the church demanded clarity. Faith became law, law became faith. And the emperor, who had claimed to serve the cross, now governed it with imperial decree in Byzantium, a faded Greek city overlooking the Bosporus. Constantine envisioned not just a capital, but a second Roma, Christian Rome. He walked its hills with divine ambition. claiming to be guided by the hand of God as he traced the city's sacred boundaries. Over 4 years, Constantinople rose from dust and marble, grand forums, gleaming basilicas, and the Church of the Holy Apostles, where Constantine would be entombed as a 13th apostle in stone. Pagan temples were tolerated, but dwarfed by churches. Sol Invictus still adorned some coins, but the cross towered over all. And yet, as his city rose, the church splintered again. Bishops turned into pawns. Doctrine was shaped not by prayer, but by imperial edict. Athanasius, the great defender of orthodoxy, was exiled repeatedly. Arians found new life in court circles. Constantine, once the liberator of Christians, became their master. He ruled not merely over bodies, but over souls, tethering theology to the throne. Even in death, he symbolized the imperial baptism of faith, dying in 337 AD, still unbaptized, until his final breath, when he received the sacrament as emperor, not penitent. His 3 sons inherited an empire stained with both blood and gospel, but instead of unity, they brought fratricide. Family was butchered, power was carved like meat. Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius II waged war on each other and on the church. Under Constantius II, Arianism returned, with imperial might. Nicaea was rolled back. Bishops replaced, councils manipulated, and the faith bent to the will of a devout yet domineering ruler. Christianity became an extension of policy and disagreement, became exile. Where the martyrs once died for the truth, now truth itself was shackled to imperial survival. But the gods had not been entirely slain. Out of the ashes of the purges rose Julian, Constantine's last surviving nephew, raised in secret, forged in philosophy, and baptized in bitterness. When he seized the purple in 361 AD, he cast off Christ with the fury of a man avenging centuries of forgotten gods. He restored temples, revived sacrifices, and declared war not by blade, but by culture, banning Christians from teaching classical texts, mocking the Gospels, and writing bitter screeds against the Galilean carpenter, who now ruled the empire from beyond the grave. Julian sought to resurrect a Rome of Homer and Apollo, but it was too late. The temples he rebuilt stood empty, the philosophers he championed found few listeners, and the divine he summoned had no more thunder to give. In 363 AD, Julian fell in battle against Persia, bleeding in the sand, whispering, "You have won, Galilean." His death marked the final gasp of the pagan world. The victory was Christ, but the cost was steep. In the aftermath, Theodosius I rose, determined to finish Constantine's dream by law and fire. He made Nicene Christianity the only legal faith of the empire, outlawed pagan sacrifices, disbanded the Vestal Virgins, and closed the temples. The gods of Rome, who had endured for 1,000 years, were finally silent. But in slaying the old gods, the empire had not found peace, it had only rebranded its power. The church now wielded the sword. Bishops issued imperial orders. Heretics were hunted, not by pagans, but by fellow Christians. Faith became law. The altar became a throne. When Theodosius died in 395, the empire was divided forever between East and West, between 2 sons, 2 courts, 2 destinies. Arcadius ruled in Constantinople, aloof and weak, while Honorius ruled in the West, under the shadow of generals and Gothic mercenaries. Rome, once the unshakable heart of empire, was now a brittle echo, surrounded by chaos and increasingly abandoned by history. The East entrenched itself behind theology and bureaucracy. The West decayed beneath its own weight. The Church, now enshrined in law, was torn by endless heresies. Tonodists, Arians, Pelagians and emperors continued to play God in deciding which souls would be saved or silenced. And yet, through it all, Constantine's shadow loomed. He had not just reformed the empire, he had redefined it. He had given it a new god, a new capital, a new creed. But he had also forged a new paradox, a kingdom not of this world, ruled by emperors of this one. The Church had conquered the empire, but in doing so, it had become part of it. And so Constantine's legacy endured not merely in stone or scripture, but in the soul of every cross-bearer who came after. He had looked to the sky and seen a cross. He had taken that sign to war, and in his triumph he had saved the empire, or perhaps he had only prolonged its fall. When Emperor Theodosius I died in 395 AD, the empire did not grieve it, braced for division. His body lay in state beneath a golden cross, robed in purple and incense. But the unity he preserved with iron and faith died with him. The Roman world, now baptized in the name of Christ, was too vast, too fractured, too weary to remain whole. He left behind 2 sons, Arcadius, soft, suspicious, and cloistered in Constantinople, and Honorius, a mere child sheltered within the decaying halls of Milan. The East and West were now severed not by sword, but by inheritance, and though both claimed to be Rome, they grew apart in tongue, in strength, and in soul. The East had wealth, cities, and walls. The West had memories, rot, and borders on fire. Honorius, surrounded by courtiers and eunuchs, ruled in name only. Real power rested with Stilicho, a half-Vandal general of iron discipline and bitter loyalty. It was Stilicho who commanded the armies, negotiated with kings, and tried desperately to hold back the tides. The frontiers groaned under pressure. Goths in the Balkans, Vandals on the Rhine, and whispers of the Huns growing louder to the east. Rome still claimed dominion over the world, but its legions were shadows of their former Mitundripade, undermanned, often replaced by foederati. Barbarian allies kept barely loyal with land and promises the empire could no longer afford. Cities decayed, farmlands were abandoned, roads cracked, and across the empire, people no longer spoke of victory, but of survival. Senators clung to tradition, even as their estates fell to ruin. Bishops took up roles once held by governors. In this fragile world, Stilicho stood like a fading statue of old Rome, resolute, proud, and destined to fall. For though he fought back the storms, outwitted, in 408, Stilicho was accused of treason and executed, his head displayed on a spike, his loyal soldiers massacred, his alliances shattered. With Stilicho's fall, Rome lost not only its sword, but its last competent shield. The Western Empire now stood exposed, an empty shell with a trembling boy emperor, a shrinking army, and fate closing in from all sides. He was once a Roman ally, a trusted general trained in Roman camps and armored in Roman steel, but Alaric, king of the Visigoths, would become the first man in 8 centuries to breach the walls of the Eternal City. raised among Roman legions, yet denied the rewards granted to others. Alaric had marched beneath imperial banners, bled for the empire, and asked only for recognition, a command, land for his people, a voice in the court that once shaped the world. But Rome, ever proud and blind to its own decline, refused him, and so, rejected and betrayed, Alaric turned from ally to enemy. With Stilicho dead and Rome's diplomacy in ruins, he gathered his Gothic warriors and descended upon Italy, not as a barbarian invader, but as a man demanding justice from the world's most ancient throne. In 408, Alaric laid siege to Rome not with catapults, but with patience. He cut off its grain, blockaded its roads, and watched as hunger hollowed the once great city from within. Inside the walls, noble families sold their jewelry for bread. Children starved, disease took root, and prayers turned bitter. Rome, the mistress of the world, now trembled before a king she had scorned. When a ransom was paid, Alaric withdrew, but the damage was done. In 410, after endless deceit and failed negotiations, Alaric returned and, for 3 days, unleashed his fury. The Visigoths poured through the Salarian gate. They looted palaces, emptied vaults, and desecrated monuments. But this was no wild massacre. It was cold, organized vengeance. Churches were mostly spared. The Senate was humiliated. And as gold was dragged from temples and Roman citizens fled into the hills, the world gasped. Rome had been sacked, not by Hannibal, nor by civil war, but by her own forgotten children, the federated outsiders Rome had trained, used, and discarded. Saint Jerome, writing from distant Bethlehem, groaned, "If Rome can perish, what is safe?" It was not the fall of Rome, not yet, but it was the fall of an illusion, the belief that Rome, crowned by the gods and anointed by Christ, could never bleed. In the stillness after the sack, Rome did not burn, but it never truly woke again. The smoke had cleared, the looters marched on, but the soul of the eternal city remained broken. Once the seat of emperors and the pride of civilization, Rome became a mausoleum of memory, its marble temples hollow, its senators reduced to shadows. The Forum, where once Cicero's voice thundered, was now a grazing ground for goats. Dust gathered in basilicas, columns cracked, and fountains ran dry. A stunned silence fell upon the empire. Across the Christian world, people searched for meaning in the unthinkable. Had God abandoned Rome? Had the Church failed to protect the city anointed by Constantine? Pagan philosophers seized the moment, crying out that the old gods had turned their faces away because altars were empty and temples closed. But in North Africa, a voice answered not with panic, but with philosophy. Augustine of Hippo, bishop and former rhetorician, penned his masterpiece, The City of God, arguing that Rome was not eternal, only the heavenly kingdom was. His words gave hope, but also sealed a truth. The Rome of bricks and blood was mortal. Even as theology soothed the faithful, the decay was undeniable. Rome's economy collapsed. Its population dwindled from over 1 million to a hushed fraction. Emperors no longer lived. Their Honorius cowered in Ravenna, a swamp-bound fortress far removed from history's heart. The Senate still met, robes still fluttered, but they presided over ghosts. Meanwhile, Constantinople flourished, its walls strong, its court stable, its bishops commanding emperors, not the other way around. The East had taken the future, The West clung to statues, yet the image of Rome lingered majestic in ruin, sacred in silence. The sack of 410 did not destroy the empire, but it revealed a terrible truth. The core had rotted, and the empire's greatest city was now just a memory wrapped in marble. The barbarians no longer battered Rome's gates. They now walked freely through them, wrapped in Roman cloaks, wielding Roman titles, and commanding Roman legions. As the empire struggled to hold its crumbling borders, it had turned to the very peoples it once called barbarian for help. Foederati federated allies were granted land in exchange for service. But service turned to sovereignty, and soon entire provinces were governed not by Rome, but by those it had once feared. The army itself was no longer Roman in soul or blood. The legions that marched wore the empire's eagle, but spoke Gothic tongues, honored foreign gods, and fought for pay, not patria. Amid this uneasy balance stood one man who understood both sides of the crumbling world, Flavius Idius, Roman by name, hostage of the Huns in youth, diplomat and warrior in adulthood. Idius maneuvered through the chaos like a dying empire's last chessmaster. He made allies of his enemies and enemies of his rivals, holding the West together by force of will and careful treachery. But even Idius could not undo what Rome had become: a state without citizens, a shell led by puppets. Emperors were now mere ornaments, chosen and discarded by generals like Idius or barbarian strongmen like Ricimer. As provinces slipped away, Britannia, Hispania, Gallia Empire responded not with reform but with denial. In the provinces, Roman villas stood abandoned, towns emptied, aqueducts collapsed, and fields fell to ruin. Cities that once hummed with law and commerce now echoed with silence. But the greatest threat had not yet arrived. Beyond the Danube, beyond the crumbling limes, a tempest was gathering. In the shadowed forests and grasslands of the east, beneath banners stitched in blood, a new power was rising. It did not seek Rome's favor, nor its throne. It sought only conquest, and its name would soon haunt the world. Attila, from the plains beyond the Danube came Attila, crowned not with laurel but with terror, called by his enemies the Scourge of God, with a face carved like iron and a will forged in blood. He led a horde of Huns across the horizon, leaving ash in his wake. His name whispered through cities like a curse. He demanded tribute from emperors and obedience from kings, and in 451 AD he stormed into Gaul, only to meet the last flicker of Roman resistance. Sidious, rallying what was left of the West's courage at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. Romans, Visigoths, and even remnants of the empire's former enemies stood together against annihilation. They held the line, and Attila retreated, but it was a victory without triumph, a gasp from a dying body. The next year, Attila descended into Italy itself, torching cities and scattering refugees like dust before the wind. The empire was paralyzed, defenseless. And then, miraculously, he stopped. On the road to Rome, Pope Leo I, alone but robed in the moral authority of centuries, rode out to meet the barbarian king. What was said is lost to time, but when Attila turned back, legends were born. Some said angels stood behind Leo, others said gold was quietly paid. But whatever the cause, the eternal city was spared once more. When Attila died in 453, choking on blood after a night of feasting Rome exhaled. But it was only a breath before drowning. Future kings would call themselves Caesars in foreign tongues. Rome had fallen, yes, but not vanished. From the ashes of empire rose the seeds of Christendom, of feudal Europe, of the medieval age. Its monuments crumbled, but its dream endured. The empire that had once ruled the world now lay in dust, but in dust it left its mark on eternity. When the Western Empire collapsed into dust, the East did not mourn it fortified, rising on the shores of the Bosporus like a bridge between continents and centuries. Constantinople stood defiant, crowned in gold and guarded by sea and stone. This city, once a minor Greek settlement called Byzantium, had been reborn by Constantine the Great as Nova Roma, but its soul had long since transformed. It was no longer a copy of Rome, it was its air, its refinement, its transformation. With its soaring domes, labyrinthine forums, and triple-layered Theodosian walls, Constantinople was not merely defended, it was invincible. While the West burned, this city shone, collecting refugees, gold, and culture from every corner of the shattered Latin world. Greek became the language of administration, but Latin titles remained: Caesar, Augustus, Imperator. Here, emperors still ruled in absolute splendor, draped in silks, their every movement choreographed like divine theater. The church was not merely an institution, it was the state's spine, and theology flowed like blood through every corridor of power. The people, the demos, were passionate and volatile, chanting in the hippodrome, rioting for charioteers and Christ alike, ready to elevate emperors or drag them down. The West had died with a whimper, but the East survived with a roar, not through nostalgia, but through adaptation. Constantinople was not Rome, it was something new, something harder, something eternal. It was not merely the last bastion of the Roman Empire. It was Rome reimagined, clad not in togas, but in armor, icons, and empire. He was born in a peasant's hut in the rugged hills of Illyria. Yet his name would echo through marble halls and shadow every emperor after him: Justinian, the last man who truly believed he could resurrect Rome. Raised by an ambitious uncle, the future emperor Justin, the young Justinian was sent to Constantinople as a youth, where he devoured knowledge like a starving man at a feast law, theology, philosophy, and the intricacies of imperial power. When he rose to the throne in 527 AD, the city held its breath, for he was no ordinary monarch. He was a man possessed by vision. His dream was as grand as it was impossible: to restore the Roman Empire in its totality, to reclaim the West, reform the law, cleanse the court, and sanctify the state beneath the Christian God. But to govern a city as volatile as Constantinople, he would need more than vision. He would need fire. That fire came in the form of his wife, Theodora, a former actress and courtesan with a mind as sharp as any blade. Together they were a paradox, he, the ascetic scholar, she, the worldly cynic, but they ruled as one, locking hands during riots, kneeling in prayer during plague, and standing together when the empire trembled beneath their feet. In 532, during the infamous Nika riots, when the city burned and the mob demanded his head, it was Theodora who refused to flee, uttering words that would become legend. Purple makes a fine shroud. Justinian stayed, crushed the revolt with ruthless force, and rebuilt Constantinople grander than ever. His reign would be defined not only by his resolve, but by his ambition, a divine obsession to mold the world in Rome's image. One law, one faith, one empire. But ambition has a cost, and as his armies marched west, cracks began to form beneath the gold dot to rebuild Rome. Justinian needed a sword in Belisarius. He found a blade forged in loyalty and sharpened by genius. Young, stoic, and ruthless. When duty demanded it, Flavius Belisarius rose from humble origins to become the most brilliant general of his age, a man who seemed cut from the same cloth as Scipio and Caesar, with a handful of elite troops and a mind for strategy unmatched in the empire. He launched Justinian's campaign to reconquer the West. He stormed North Africa in a lightning war, shattering the Vandal kingdom in months, restoring Carthage to imperial control like a ghost reclaimed from time. From there, he turned toward Italy, where Gothic kings had ruled for decades. In battle after battle, siege after siege, Belisarius moved like a shadow, taking Naples, liberating Rome, and capturing Ravenna. The dream of Roman restoration flickered alive once more. But at every turn, court intrigues undermined him. Rivals, whispers of disloyalty, and Justinian's own suspicious heart turned victory bitter. Belisarius was recalled, honored, sent out again, then recalled, once more praised, but never trusted. And as if the gods themselves recoiled at Justinian's ambition, a darker shadow fell. The plague of Justinian, carried in from the east, swept through Constantinople in 541 like a silent reaper. Corpses piled in the streets, entire districts went silent, and Justinian himself lay near death for weeks. The city that had survived fire and riot now fought a battle against breath itself. Tens of thousands perished, and the empire staggered under the weight of death. Yet Belisarius fought on, returning to battle again and again. Even as his resources dwindled, his victories were sabotaged, and his enemies multiplied not only on the field, but in his own court. He would come to embody the tragedy of a restored Rome, brilliant, brave, and ultimately betrayed by the very thing he fought to save. In Belisarius, Rome had its last great general land in the plague. It had its cruelest reckoning. If Belisarius carved Rome's memory into blood and conquest, Justinian etched it into stone and light, and nowhere did his vision manifest more divinely than in the towering wonder that would come to define an empire, the Hagia Sophia, built from the ashes of the Nika riots, where angry mobs once choked the streets with smoke and corpses. This monumental cathedral rose like a phoenix, daring heaven itself. Architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, wielding geometry like sacred scripture, conceived of a space so vast, so impossible, that many feared it would collapse before it ever opened. But Justinian demanded a miracle, and the empire bent to his will. Gold mosaics caught sunlight like the fires of creation. Vast domes soared above the faithful like the firmament itself. The dome not resting on earth, but seemingly suspended from the divine, became a symbol of holy dominion, a statement not only of faith, but of power. When the final stone was placed, and incense first rose toward the ceiling like ascending prayer, Justinian stood beneath that dome, arms raised, and declared, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." Hagia Sophia was not just a church, was an empire in miniature, where theology met architecture. where divine right fused with imperial will, where the Roman tradition became Byzantine magnificence. It became the center of worship, of coronation, of diplomacy, and awe for nearly 1,000 years. Beneath its soaring arches, emperors were crowned and excommunicated. Armies were blessed, heretics condemned, and voices rose in the Greek liturgy as if singing directly to the celestial spheres. In stone, Justinian achieved what sword and law could not. He made Rome eternal not in the ruins of the Forum, but in a cathedral whose beauty could silence armies and whose shadow would stretch across centuries and faiths. It was the heart of a new Rome, not born in conquest but in wonder, as marble domes gleamed under the sun. A war brewed within the soul of Byzantium, not of swords or borders, but of images, of what could and could not be seen, of what was sacred and what was idolatry. In the West, Rome had fallen to fire and steel, but in the East, the empire nearly tore itself apart over icons. For centuries, the faithful had venerated painted images of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints not as gods, but as windows to the divine portals through which the invisible could be touched. But as emperors saw the growing power of the monastic movement and the people's passion for holy images, they grew uneasy. What began as theological concern turned into imperial edict. In the 8th century, Emperor Leo III, hardened by war and fear of divine punishment, launched the era of iconoclasm, ordering the destruction of sacred images across the empire. Mosaics were scraped from walls, icons smashed, relics burned. Monks resisted with furious devotion, some dying in defense of their painted saints, others mutilated by soldiers carrying out the emperor's will. Churches once filled with golden eyes and outstretched hands became cold, bare, stripped of the divine gaze. The people rioted, bishops were exiled, and the empire convulsed not from invasion but from spiritual civil war. In Rome, the Pope watched in horror, and the already fragile bridge between East and West fractured further. For decades, Byzantium oscillated between iconoclast and iconophile emperors, each one shaping the faith not through scripture, but by decree. But in the end, it was not the sword that resolved it was a woman. Empress Theodora, ruling as regent in the mid-9th century, restored the icons to their former glory, ending the controversy with a quiet decree and an iron will. Faith returned to the walls of Hagia Sophia, and the empire, scarred but intact, rediscovered its divine mirror. Yet the damage was done not only to churches, but to unity. The West drifted further, the Pope stood prouder, and Byzantium's soul bore the fracture of belief turned to flame. In defending images, the empire revealed something deeper, that in Byzantium, faith was not a comfort, it was a battlefield. While icons sparked fury within, enemies gathered without, and Byzantium, ever proud, ever radiant, found itself besieged on every side. In the East, the ancient rival stirred again. The Sassanid Persians, heirs to Achaemenid ambition, launched a war not of skirmishes but of annihilation. Under Khosrow II, the Persians poured into Byzantine lands, seizing Syria, Palestine, Egypt, even threatening Constantinople itself. The empire was on the brink of collapse, and into this desperation rose a warrior emperor who would stake everything on salvation. Young, daring, and with fire in his eyes, Heraclius sailed from North Africa, seized the throne, and led a series of campaigns so daring, so impossible, that they seemed conjured from myth. He crossed into Persian lands, struck at their heart, and in 627, at the Battle of Nineveh, shattered Khosrow's power. The relic of the true cross, stolen from Jerusalem, was reclaimed and returned in triumph. For a fleeting moment, it seemed Byzantium had won. But even as the banners flew and bells rang, a new power emerged, one neither Heraclius nor Rome itself had foreseen. In the deserts of Arabia, beneath the burning sun and the green banner of Islam, the followers of the Prophet Muhammad surged forth with a fury not born of empire but of revelation. In less than a generation, Muslim armies swept across the Byzantine East like wildfire. Damascus fell, then Jerusalem, then Alexandria. Whole provinces vanished, swallowed by a new and zealous world. Byzantium, exhausted and wounded, fell back behind the walls of Constantinople. And it was those walls, ancient, layered, and blessed, that saved the empire again. In 674, and again in 717, Arab sieges thundered against the city. But the Byzantines unleashed a secret weapon, Greek fire, a liquid flame that clung to water and flesh, impossible to quench. It roared across enemy ships and turned the waves into infernos. The caliphate withdrew, but the cost of survival was staggering. The empire was smaller, poorer, and forever changed. Latin had faded, Greek reigned. Old Roman legions were gone, replaced by Theme's regional armies, hardened by centuries of siege and war. The soul of the empire had shifted not westward, but inward. Byzantium had not fallen, but it had become something else, a fire fortress surrounded by a world that no longer spoke Latin, no longer remembered the Caesars, and no longer feared the eagle. Glory had been bought, but the price was steep. An empire still alive, but gasping. By the 11th century, East and West no longer merely faced opposite horizons. They spoke in different tongues, worshipped with different hearts, and dreamed different dreams. Once bound by shared creeds and the memory of Rome, the Latin West and the Greek East had slowly unraveled across centuries of suspicion, pride, and wounded faith. The seeds were old planted when emperors crowned themselves without papal blessing, when the Pope condemned iconoclasts, when Rome and Constantinople battled not with swords, but with letters and liturgies. The East called the West arrogant. The West called the East heretical. In the West, the Pope claimed supremacy over all Christendom. In the East, the Patriarch stood beside the Emperor, not beneath him. The two churches no longer saw the same Christ in their images, nor the same Spirit in their sacraments. And when tempers finally shattered into action, it happened not with war, but with ritual and insult. In 1054 AD, amid rising tensions over doctrine, custom, and power, emissaries from Pope Leo IX marched into the Hagia Sophia during divine liturgy and laid a bull of excommunication upon the altar. The Patriarch, Michael Cerularius, equally indignant, returned the favor in kind. Thus was born the Great Schismna, formal rupture between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, a fracture not of geography, but of soul. And though no blood was shed that day, its wounds would never fully heal. From that moment, East and West became not partners in Christendom, but rivals, cloaked in holiness. The Pope no longer prayed with the Patriarch. The Byzantines no longer looked to Rome for guidance, and Rome no longer saw Constantinople as a sister. but as a heretic court dressed in fading gold. The empire that had once stretched from Hadrian's Wall to Jerusalem now stood alone, surrounded not only by enemies of the sword, but estranged from the church that once crowned its emperors. Byzantium had survived Persians, Arabs, and plague, but now it faced a new enemy: isolation, the slow suffocation of empire, not by conquest, but by the cutting of ties that once bound the Christian world into one body. It called itself Roman until its final breath, but by the 14th century, the empire of Constantine had become a miracle of endurance, a ghost walking through time, clad in ancient glory. Byzantium had outlived its western twin by nearly 1,000 years, had survived plague, siege, schism, and betrayal, but all that remained now was the city of Constantinople and a scattering of fragile provinces. The emperors still wore purple, still presided over coronations in Hagia Sophia, still signed edicts in Latin script, but their armies were mercenaries, their palaces crumbling, their ships few. The once great capital was now a lonely island, surrounded by a sea of rising powers. In the Balkans, the Serbs and Bulgars pressed from the north. In the east, a new and unstoppable force emerged: the Ottoman Turks, whose banners bore the crescent moon, and whose cannon would soon rewrite history. Under the brilliant and ruthless young Sultan, Mehmed II, the Ottomans encircled Constantinople. The city's defenders numbered barely 7,000 Greeks, Genoese monks, and children against an army of over 80,000. But the Byzantines did not bow. Constantine, the 11th Palaiologos, the final emperor, clad himself in armor and stood upon the walls, not as a fading monarch, but as a Roman, a defender of a dream that had once ruled the world. For 51 days the siege raged. The air shook with cannon fire, the night burned with torches, and prayers rose like smoke from every dome. Then, on May 29, 1453, the walls finally broke. Ottoman troops surged through the city, and Constantine, refusing to flee, vanished into the melee, his body never found, his last words lost to the wind. Hagia Sophia, once echoing with Greek hymns, now rang with the call to prayer. The Eastern Roman Empire, born of Caesar, baptized by Constantine, forged in flame and faith, had fallen. But its death was not defeat. The legacy of Byzantium passed into Orthodox liturgy, into Russian Tsars, who called themselves Caesars, into Renaissance scholars who carried Greek texts westward and reignited Europe's flame. Constantinople itself would live on as Istanbul, a jewel of Islam, its past layered in conquest and splendor. The empire was gone, but its memory, its art, its law, its theology, its stubborn, sacred idea. Rome had fallen twice, once in the west and now in the east, but in both deaths something eternal had escaped the grave. The Byzantines had not merely extended Roman history, they had transformed it, wrapping it in gold and gospel, and passing it on to a world that no longer remembered its name, but still lived in its shadow. It began with a sermon, a cry from a pope's lips that echoed across a continent torn by blood feuds and spiritual longing. When, in 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II stood before a sea of armored lords and ragged pilgrims and called upon Christendom to take up the cross and march east, not for conquest, but for salvation, not for gold, but for God. He spoke of Christians in the East suffering under the yoke of the Muslim world, of Jerusalem defiled and of sins that could be washed away in the sacred blood of battle. The crowd erupted in fury and faith, chanting Deus Vult, Deus Vult, God wills it, and the fire that had begun as a political plea ignited into a holy wildfire that would consume cities, dynasties, and centuries of fragile unity. But few in the crowd understood the full truth, that the call to arms had been triggered not by papal inspiration alone, but by a desperate letter from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, whose once mighty empire now reeled under the onslaught of Seljuk Turks, its Anatolian heartland broken, its armies scattered. Alexios sought trained mercenaries to reinforce the empire's fraying frontiers. What he got was a tidal wave of Western warriors, princes, and peasants, all bearing crosses sewn onto their tunics and visions of heaven in their eyes. And behind that pious glow flickered other hungersland, title, gold, and glory for many, saw in the East not just a battlefield, but a prize. Thus began the First Crusade, not as a unified march of Christian brotherhood, but as a collision course between two worlds, Latin knights whose swords bore the weight of divine wrath, and Byzantine emperors who saw in them both salvation and ruin. What followed would not only change the fate of Jerusalem, but would draw a dagger across the heart of Christian unity, leaving wounds that never truly healed, and placing Constantinople not at the center of the crusading dream, but directly in its path. They came not as an army, but as a torrent, princes, knights, monks, mercenaries, and zealots, tens of thousands of them pouring eastward across Europe like a tide of iron and prayer, answering Urban's call, but with ambitions all their own. When the leaders of the First Crusade arrived at Constantinople in 1096 and 1097, men like Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman warlord with fire in his blood, Godfrey of Bouillon, pious and resolute, and Raymond of Toulouse, proud and suspicious, they found not a grateful emperor, but a cautious one. Alexios I Komnenos, ever the tactician, welcomed them with calculated hospitality. But he saw clearly what many in his court feared. These were not holy pilgrims, they were armed kings without kingdoms, and the treasures of the East glittered in their eyes. The Latins, for their part, viewed the Byzantine court with disdain, its silken robes, its labyrinthine politics, its gold-encrusted bureaucracy reeked of decadence and deceit to men forged in the brutal feudal West. Alexios demanded oaths of loyalty before granting passage across the Bosporus, swearing that all lands recaptured from the Turks would be returned to the empire. Some crusader leaders agreed reluctantly and often dishonestly. The siege of Nicaea, the first true confrontation with the Seljuks, revealed the fragile alliance. Alexios negotiated a separate surrender with the garrison, denying the Latins the chance to plunder, and fury simmered beneath their banners. As the Crusaders pushed into Anatolia, then toward Antioch and Jerusalem, their victories were paid for in blood and starvation. But the Byzantines' diplomatic, measured, little support beyond promises. To the Latins, this was treachery. To the Byzantines, it was survival. As the Crusades succeeded beyond all expectations, taking Jerusalem in 1099 amid a massacre that bathed the holy city in Christian blood, it left in its wake not only shattered Muslim armies, but also shattered trust. The Crusaders established their own Latin kingdoms in the east, and Alexios' empire received almost nothing in return. What had begun as a cry for help ended in quiet betrayal. And as the last knights departed Constantinople, the Byzantines looked westward, not with gratitude, but with dread. They had invited a tempest, and though the storm had passed, its clouds still lingered, heavy with the threat of what was yet to come. The First Crusade had been a brutal miracle. Jerusalem taken, kingdoms carved, but miracles do not last. And soon the Latin states in the Holy Land, isolated and fragile, began to fracture. In 1144, the great city of Edessa fell to the Muslim warlord Zengi, and across Europe, panic turned to zeal once more. Thus was born the Second Crusade, summoned by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who preached with burning eyes and a silver tongue, calling kings themselves to war. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany answered. But what followed was not triumph, it was a slow, humiliating march into chaos. The Byzantines, now ruled by the cautious and calculating Manuel I Komnenos, welcomed the Crusaders with uneasy diplomacy, watching with growing alarm as two of the most powerful monarchs in Christendom camped outside Constantinople's gates. With armies hungry for salvation or spoils, tensions flared as the Germans clashed with Byzantine guides, and the French suspected treachery at every turn. When the Crusaders finally passed into Anatolia, they were met not by victory, but by ambush, disease, and starvation. The Germans were decimated. The French fared little better. The campaign against Damascus ended in utter failure, and the crusade collapsed, leaving only bitterness in its wake. Byzantium, blamed for everything, was now seen not as a Christian ally, but as a duplicitous rival. The Third Crusade, launched after the fall of Jerusalem to the legendary Saladin in 1187, brought new titans into the fray: Richard the Lionheart, Philip Augustus, and Frederick Barbarossa. But even their legends could not restore unity. Frederick drowned en route, Philip quarreled and left. Richard clashed not only with the Muslims but also with the Byzantine court, which he viewed with contempt. Manuel's successors, weakened by intrigue, tried to navigate between Latin fury and Muslim resurgence, but the trust between East and West had long since turned to suspicion. Byzantium's cautious diplomacy, designed for survival, was interpreted as sabotage. Latin pride, blind to nuance, saw only betrayal. By the close of the Third Crusade, the Holy Land remained contested, but the true battlefield had shifted. In Jerusalem or Acre, but in the space between Latin sword and Greek shadow, where alliances once born of faith had soured into contempt, the Crusades, meant to unite Christendom, were slowly tearing it apart. By the dawn of the 13th century, the idea of crusade had decayed from holy mission to political weapon, and no campaign revealed its corruption more savagely than the Fourth Crusade, where swords meant for Jerusalem turned instead toward Christendom's beating heart. The call went out in 1202, yet, unlike the earlier Crusades, this was no noble charge across Europe, but a transaction bound by debt and deceit. The Crusaders, lacking funds to transport their army across the sea, turned to Venice, that calculating city of lagoons and ledgers, where gold mattered more than God. The Doge, Enrico Dandolo, old and nearly blind, but razor-sharp in ambition, struck a bargain. Venice would supply ships if the Crusaders helped reclaim Zara, a Christian city and Venetian rival. Thus, under papal banners, An army of Christ-sacked fellow Christians earned excommunication. Still, the fleet sailed on, now corrupted by necessity and greed. In the chaos of crusading logistics arrived a Byzantine prince in exile, Alexios, Angelos, son of a deposed emperor, who promised vast sums and eastern allegiance if the Crusaders would help him reclaim his father's throne. It was temptation too great to resist. The fleet veered toward Constantinople, the crusade now wholly untethered from its divine charter. Beneath fluttering crosses, pilgrims became mercenaries, their gaze no longer fixed on Jerusalem, but on the golden domes of the Queen of Cities. For Dandolo, it was a master stroke. Venice would gain power, revenge, and riches. For the Crusaders, it was a gamble cloaked in righteousness. For Byzantium, it was a noose slowly tightening, drawn not by Muslim armies or pagan foes, but by their fellow Christians. What had once been a march of the faithful was now an enterprise of opportunists and debtors, and as the Latin fleet approached the Bosporus, the ancient tension between East and West coiled into its deadliest form, not misunderstanding, but cold, deliberate betrayal. When the masts of the Crusader fleet appeared on the horizon of Constantinople in 1203, the people within the Theodosian walls looked out not upon the armies of Islam or heathen kings, but upon Latin Christians bearing crosses on their chests, and greed in their eyes. They came not as pilgrims, but as enforcers of a debt disguised in divine rhetoric. At their head stood the exiled prince Alexios IV, a pale ghost promising to buy his way back onto the throne, with promises he could never fulfill: vast sums of gold, military aid for the crusade, and submission of the Eastern Church to the Pope. Reluctantly, the Crusaders helped him breach the gates, and Alexios III, the reigning emperor, fled into the night. The city that had resisted Persians and Arabs now bowed to a child propped up by foreigners. But Alexios IV's reign was as brittle as parchment. His promises evaporated in the Byzantine treasury, and his presence ignited fury among a populace that saw him not as a restorer, but a traitor. Within months, the streets roiled in revolt, fires lit the sky, and the Prince-Emperor was deposed, strangled by the usurper Alexios Visigoths, a hardened general who refused to cower before the Latin menace. The Crusaders, now abandoned and unpaid, turned from frustrated allies to avenging invaders. Their justification was wrapped in righteous outrage, retribution for betrayal, but their true motive was plunder. In April 1204, the Latin host launched its final assault. Siege engines smashed the walls, ladders clawed the battlements, and fire rained from above as the Queen of Cities burned. The unthinkable had become reality. Christian soldiers were besieging Constantinople, not for Christ, but for coin. Centuries of mistrust, contempt, and rivalry had reached their climax, not in diplomacy or schism, but in steel at the gates. The last defenders fell beneath a storm of Latin fury, and the doors of the city swung open to a darkness that would shame even the pagans of old. When the gates of Constantinople finally gave way, it was not victory that entered, but vengeance, greed, and the end of a world. For 3 days, in April of 1204, the city that had stood as the bastion of Christian civilization, the Second Rome, the jewel of East and West alike, was gutted by its supposed brothers in faith. Crusaders poured through the streets like a flood of steel and flame. drunk on fury and unholy righteousness. They looted palaces that had stood since the time of Constantine, ripped gold from ancient walls, and shattered marble tombs to rifle the bones of emperors. Churches became slaughterhouses, sacred relic splinters of the true cross, bones of saints. Holy icons passed down through centuries were stolen, broken, or sold like trinkets in a market. In Hagia Sophia, the heart of Orthodox Christianity, blood mixed with incense as soldiers broke into the altar, laughed while prostitutes danced upon the sacred floor, and a drunken knight enthroned himself mockingly in the patriarch's seat. Nuns were raped in convents, monks butchered in their cells, icons defaced by men who believed themselves the hand of God. Fires consumed libraries and homes alike, and centuries of Byzantine art, knowledge, and beauty were reduced to ash. Even the Venetians, more calculating than crazed, joined the pillage, carting off entire columns, horses, and mosaics. The spoils of empire ferried back across the sea to adorn the basilicas of St. Mark's in Venice, where they remain to this day. It was not the Turks, not the Mongols, not the Persians, but fellow Christians who delivered the most devastating blow to Byzantium. The sack of Constantinople was not merely a crime, it was a blasphemy, a desecration that tore the soul from the Eastern Roman Empire. And when the flames at last died down and the streets grew still, Constantinople stood not as a conquered city, but as a violated relic, its glory raped, its people scattered, its memory forever scarred. The Latins claimed a crusade had been fulfilled, but the Byzantines knew the truth. Rome had fallen again on this time. It was Christians who lit the match. From the ashes of Constantinople rose not a restored Holy Land, nor a united Christendom, but a Latin empire built on broken marble and bleeding memory, an occupation that crowned a puppet emperor in a looted palace, while the true heirs of Rome wandered the ruins of their shattered realm. The Latin Empire of Constantinople, proclaimed in 1204 under Baldwin of Flanders, was born not in triumph, but in delusion, an empire of foreigners who neither understood the city they ruled nor the civilization they had destroyed. Its coffers were empty, its borders contested, and its thrones stained by conquest. Meanwhile, the Byzantine elite, those who survived the fire and rape, fled eastward and westward, founding fragmentary successor states in Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizondic, proclaiming itself the true continuation of the Roman line, each striving not just to survive, but to reclaim the memory of what had been lost. In Nicaea, the most potent of these embers, the Lascaris dynasty built courts of exile and armies of vengeance, slowly rebuilding the imperial framework in miniature while dreaming of return. But the Latin occupiers ruled Constantinople with heavy hands and foreign tongues, unable to unify their own barons, let alone command the allegiance of a bitter Greek population that saw them not as liberators, but as invaders in priestly disguise. The Orthodox Church, decapitated, with unbowed, withdrew from the city and re-established its hierarchy in exile, preserving traditions, liturgy, and the unbreakable belief that Rome still lived, not in the Latin crown of Baldwin, but in the ashes carried east. For nearly 60 years, Byzantium survived in fragments, clinging to its identity like a relic hidden from looters. And though its people wept in foreign lands and its emperors ruled from temporary courts, the dream of return never died. And in the West, despite papal attempts to claim unity, the schism widened into a chasm. The sack had not mended Christendom, it had dismembered it, and as the Latin Empire floundered, bled by enemies on all sides, and rotted from within, the exiled Byzantines waited, watched, and sharpened their memory into a blade, not just to reclaim a city, but to resurrect an empire that had been buried alive. Long after the flames died in Constantinople, the smoke of 1204 still lingered in the soul of Byzantium, and its echo haunted Christendom like a curse spoken in a dying breath. The sack had not simply looted a city, had broken a civilization's trust, a betrayal so profound that no council or creed could ever mend it. The great schism between East and West, once theological and political, had now become visceral, lived, and irreparable. The Byzantines no longer saw the Latins as brothers in Christ, but as desecrators, men who had raped the Virgin of the East, defiled the holiest sanctuary of orthodoxy, and crowned themselves heirs of Rome with blood still dripping from their hands. Even after Michael VIII Palaiologos recaptured Constantinople in 1261, slipping through the weakened Latin defenses and restoring a native emperor to the palace of Constantine, the scars remained. The city was reclaimed, but never restored. It returned not as a capital of strength, but as a ghost of its former self. Hagia Sophia's golden dome rose once more above the skyline, but its mosaics had been looted, its relics scattered to western cathedrals where Greek saints adorned Latin altars. The West rejoiced in its trophies, the East wept for its wounds. The trauma of the Fourth Crusade lived on in Orthodox prayers, in sermons whispered to children, in the bitterness passed from patriarch to priest. No union between churches would ever truly succeed again, not at Lyons, not at Florence, because beneath every negotiation lay the charred bones of 1204. And in this shattered memory, the Byzantines began to understand that they stood truly alone. The Crusades, which had begun as a call to defend Constantinople, had instead delivered its most fatal blow. Rome had not only fallen twice, it had been betrayed by its own reflection, and so the empire limped on into its final centuries, no longer as the master of a universal faith, but as a haunted heir of a past that could not be resurrected. The golden horn gleamed under the sun, but its waters carried only the shadows of ships long vanished. The Latin cross had come not to save Byzantium, but to bury it, and in doing so, set fire to the last light of Rome. It should have been a moment of triumph, a second birth for an empire thought dead, but when Michael VIII Palaiologos reclaimed Constantinople in 1261, he did not find a radiant throne waiting for him, but a city gutted, looted, and hollow. Its palaces burned, its churches desecrated, its streets haunted by ghosts of Latin conquest. For nearly 60 years, the city had lived under foreign rule, and though the Latin Empire was weak and crumbling by the time Michael's general, Alexios Strategopoulos, recaptured the capital in a surprise raid, what was regained was not glory but ruin. The golden city of Justinian now lay draped in poverty, her mosaics blackened with soot, her libraries scattered to Venice, her people reduced to scavengers in imperial shadow. And yet Michael VIII declared a renaissance, crowning himself in Hagia Sophia as the rightful Roman emperor, dreaming not just of restoration but of reconquest. But the empire he inherited was no longer the mighty dominion of the Comnenoi, was a fractured, skeletal realm, beset on every side by new enemies and internal dissent. Anatolia had been lost to the Turkish Beyliks. Greece was fragmented among Latin lords, and the Balkans seethed with rebellion and foreign intrigue. Michael's court in Constantinople became a theater of costly pageantry masking economic collapse. His coffers drained not for defense, but for diplomacy. To buy time, he made enemies of his own people, and compromising with the papacy to seek Western protection. The people, devout and proud, saw these bargains not as salvation but as sacrilege, and resentment festered like rot beneath the marble. Though the city had been won, the empire's soul had not returned, and Michael's rule would set the tone for the bitter twilight of Byzantium, a desperate balancing act between memory and survival, where emperors wore the purple not as rulers of the world, but as caretakers of a dying flame. The Roman Empire lived again, but only in name. A wounded lion bleeding slowly behind golden walls. Asterisk what the sword could not conquer. Ambition and betrayal slowly consumed from within, as the restored Byzantine Empire slipped not into recovery, but into a spiral of civil war, factional rot, and self-inflicted wounds. After the death of Michael VIII in 1282, the empire fell into the hands of his son, Andronikos, to Palaiologos, a devout philosophical ruler more suited to the monastery than the throne. He slashed the army to fund monasteries, disbanded the navy to preserve courtly ritual, and leaned upon diplomacy, while pirates raided the seas and Turkish warlords carved up Anatolia. The empire shrank like melting wax, its borders collapsing inward, while the court bickered over relics and pride. The Ottomans, once a minor threat, now surged from the east like a tide, and still the Byzantines fought each other more fiercely than they fought the enemy. Andronikos II's own grandson, Andronikos III, led a brutal rebellion against him, plunging the empire into years of bloody civil war, where father fought son, cousin betrayed cousin, and mercenaries ran wild. In desperation, the emperors hired foreign soldiers to fight their own battles, none more devastating than the infamous Catalan Company, a band of savage adventurers led by Roger de Flor, who arrived under imperial contract, defeated Turks in Anatolia, and then turned on the empire itself when denied their pay. The Catalans pillaged Thrace like wolves, leaving entire cities in flames and imperial dignity in tatters. Even after Andronikos III briefly restored some vigor to the throne with military campaigns and reform, his death in 1341 cracked the empire, again igniting another civil war between the regency of his young son John V and the ruthless general John VI Kantakasinos. For decades, Constantinople bled from within, as emperors made alliances with the Serbians, Bulgars, even the rising Ottoman Turks, offering titles, daughters, and gold for support against fellow Byzantines. While cities starved, emperors lavished foreign soldiers with bribes, while monks wept in churches. Cannons and crossbows settled succession. The empire, once the ordered harmony of Roman law and Christian light, had become a fractured carcass, kept alive not by strength, but by the inertia of memory. As the Ottomans crept closer, and the Balkans exploded into chaos, the Byzantines, fractured and faith-racked, devoured themselves like an aging lion biting its own tail, forgetting that the walls they fought over were already surrounded by shadow. While Byzantium tore itself apart in civil war and clerical squabbling. Across the straits in Anatolia, a new force rose not with imperial titles or Roman blood, but with a sword, a banner, and the will to conquer. The Ottoman Turks, a once insignificant frontier, Beylik born in the ashes of Seljuk collapse, surged into power with a momentum that felt almost divine, led by men who moved with speed, faith, and ferocity. Osman I, then Orhan, and later Murad I, transformed the Ottomans from tribal warlords into a disciplined imperial machine, absorbing territory not through slow diplomacy but through relentless siege, cavalry shock, and religious fire. As Byzantine emperors begged for help from Latin kings and sold off treasures to survive another winter, the Ottomans crossed into Europe, seizing Gallipoli in 1354, not with war, but with nature's cunning, when an earthquake shattered its defenses and Orhan's men walked into the breach like wolves into a sheepfold. From there, they poured into the Balkans, taking city after city, while Constantinople watched, powerless, behind its ancient walls. No army came to stop them. No emperor could repel them. The once mighty Roman dominion in Asia was Gaunasia, Nicomedia, Prusa, all devoured by the Turkish advancement. With them died the rural economy that had sustained Byzantine strength for centuries. The landowning Dinotoi fled or fell, the peasantry converted or vanished, and what remained of imperial Anatolia was reduced to fading memories and abandoned churches. The Ottomans moved not just with steel, but with a sense of divine mission, casting themselves as warriors of Islam, defending against the infidel, but also as pragmatic rulers who absorbed the bureaucratic finesse of the peoples they conquered. Their power came from adaptability as much as zeal-embracing siege artillery, tolerating minorities when useful, and rewarding loyalty with land and title. To the Greeks, they were barbarians. To history, they were the future. As Constantinople grew isolated, a forgotten island in a sea of Ottoman green, the empire that had once commanded a continent now clung to its harbors like a shipwreck victim gasping in the surf. The Crescent did not rise suddenly, it rose, slowly, inexorably, and with every fortress it captured, every province it absorbed, it became clear the fate of Byzantium would not be decided by Rome or Venice or the Pope, but by a young empire, born of the steppe and the sword, now poised to inherit the throne it had come to surround. Constantine fought with sword in hand at the gate of St. Romanus, refusing escape, crying out, "The city is fallen, and I am still alive," before vanishing in the melee, never to be seen again. Hagia Sophia, once the beacon of Christian civilization, became a sanctuary for terrified citizens. Men, women, and children huddled beneath its dome, praying for a miracle that would not come. When the doors splintered and the Ottomans surged in, the great church became a place of conquest, its walls echoing with foreign prayers and the cries of the conquered. For 3 days, Constantinople was given to pillage, its palaces sacked, its icons defiled, its relics seized. But on the 3rd day, Mehmed entered the city in silence, dismounted before Hagia Sophia, and claimed his prize, not as a barbarian, but as a ruler. He ordered the church converted into a mosque and walked beneath its dome, as the new master of the old world, the conqueror of the city that had once defied Persians, Arabs, and Crusaders alike. The Roman Empire, born on the banks of the Tiber, crowned in Byzantium, and carried through flame and miracle, had ended. And yet, as the Crescent rose above the city walls, and the sun set on 1,000 years of history, something deeper stirred, not death, but transformation, the passing of one world into the hands of another, not by divine will, but by the relentless march of history. Constantinople was gone, but its soul would linger in echoes, ruins, and blood, forever caught between cross and crescent. When the smoke cleared and the last echoes of sword and prayer faded from the streets of Constantinople, the world awoke to the unthinkable truth: Rome was no more. But though the empire had perished beneath Ottoman steel, its shadow stretched far beyond the bloodied stones of its final citadel. Mehmed II, now styled Kaiser-i Ram, Caesar of Rome, did not merely claim victory. He claimed inheritance, absorbing the mantle of empire into the Ottoman soul. Constantinople became Istanbul, the new capital of a rising Muslim world, its skyline reshaped by minarets, its language and law reborn, but its soul forever layered with the bones of emperors and saints. Within its walls, Orthodox Christians became a protected millet, ruled by their own patriarch, but kneeling under the Sultan's gaze. Faith preserved in captivity, the church alive, but no longer sovereign. The relics of Byzantium, scattered to Venice, Paris, and Moscow, became trophies of conquest or symbols of continuity. Scholars fleeing the city carried their knowledge westward, seeding the Italian Renaissance with ancient Greek thought and Byzantine wisdom, igniting a new flame from the ashes of the old. In the east, in the forests of Rus, the princes of Moscow declared themselves the true heirs of the fallen empire, the Third Rome marrying Byzantine blood, adopting its double-headed eagle, and taking up the Orthodox banner abandoned by the West. Yet for the Greeks, the memory of Byzantium became a wound that never healed, a golden age glimpsed only in hymns and icons, remembered in the chant of midnight liturgies and the lament of lost glory. For centuries to come, the date May 29, 1453, would echo not merely as an end, but as a catastrophe, a rupture of sacred continuity. The West, for all its power and progress, would never understand the depth of what was lost. To the Orthodox East, Constantinople was not a city, it was Zoe, life itself, the mystical heart of a Christian empire that had stood for over a millennium. And yet, out of its fall rose something older than marble and deeper than banners' legacy, not of borders or armies, but of culture, liturgy, resilience, and memory. The Eastern Roman Empire died, but its ghost walked on in every church dome. That echoed with Byzantine chant in every Orthodox priest who whispered prayers in Greek, in every empire that dreamed of eternity. And so the story of Byzantium did not end at its fall, but transformed into myth, memory and marrow, woven into the DNA of both East and West. The empire had vanished, but the idea of Rome remained burning, not on a throne, but in the hearts of those who remembered. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, it did not vanish, shifted. Like a soul passing into another body, its name transformed, its breath altered, but its bones still firm beneath the skin of conquest. Istanbul, the city reborn beneath the crescent moon, became the jewel of a new empire, but its streets still murmured in Greek. Its aqueducts still carried the designs of Roman engineers, and its skyline remained pierced by the dome of Hagia Sophia, now echoed by the minarets rising like spears around it. Mehmed II, the conqueror, did not raise the city, he adopted it, not merely as a prize, but as a throne. He walked the halls of the Blashany Palace, preserved the institutions that could be used, and transformed the ruined forums and churches into Ottoman structures infused with memory. The ancient hippodrome, once the heart of Byzantine spectacle, became a silent monument, its obelisks weathered but defiant. Churches were repurposed or sealed, yet their foundations remained, buried beneath the swelling shadow of Islam, but not erased. The city itself, slowly repopulated with Muslims, Jews, Greeks, and Armenians, became a cosmopolis that mimicked Byzantium's own multi-ethnic past. Mehmed's court echoed Byzantine ceremony even as it dressed in turbans and silks. His scribes, writing in Ottoman Turkish layered with Greek and Persian influence, the administrative mind of Byzantium, its taxes, titles, hierarchy, and court intrigue lead directly into the Ottoman system, giving structure to a sultanate that would endure for centuries. And though the language changed, the logic of the city remained. Constantinople had not been destroyed, had been devoured, digested, and reshaped into something new, yet haunted by the old. Every stone whispered of empire, every shadow fell across a forgotten mosaic. The Ottomans may have claimed the city, but they inherited its gravity, drawn to its sacred geography, its imperial memory, its layers of meaning. Istanbul, in truth, was Constantinople in veil and silence, its ghost walking still, not in chains or lament, but in architecture, administration, and the unspoken awe that lingered in every conqueror's gaze. The Queen of Cities never truly died. She changed her name and continued her reign beneath different stars. Asterisk. Though the empire had fallen, and the double-headed eagle lay broken beneath the crescent, the Orthodox Church survived, bound not in glory but in chains, preserved by the very conquerors who had toppled its empire. Under Ottoman rule, the Greeks were not slaughtered into silence, nor forced to abandon their god. Instead, they were absorbed into the millet system, a legal framework that grouped subjects by religion, granting a measure of autonomy under the ultimate supremacy of the Sultan. And so, while the emperors were no more, a new Byzantine figure emerged, the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, not crowned but robed, not ruling from a palace but from the Fanner, a humble district that became the spiritual heart of a shattered people. The patriarch was no longer just a priest but a civil governor of the Orthodox world, responsible for collecting taxes, settling disputes, and holding together a religious identity that had lost its sword but not its soul. In catacombs and candlelit chapels, the Greek faithful whispered hymns that once echoed through Hagia Sophia, now reverberating in secret, in sorrow, and in fierce remembrance. Monasteries like Mount Athos, remote and defiant, became bastions of unbroken memory, guardians of icons, manuscripts, and prayers that stretched back to the days of Justinian. The Ottomans, practical and indifferent to theology, allowed the Church to function so long as it did not challenge imperial rule. Thus, the Orthodox faith became a paradox, protected yet powerless, visible yet voiceless, enduring in liturgy, even as it disappeared from state. Yet within this captivity, Byzantium lived, not through armies or laws, but through ritual, chant, and calendar. Easter came each year, not just as a feast, but as a protest, a celebration of resurrection in the face of conquest. The Byzantine worldview, shaped by centuries of imperial theology, persisted in the fasting, the feasts, and the dreams of every peasant who bowed before a cross etched with Greek letters. And so orthodoxy endured not as a fallen church, but as a living monument, chained but not shattered, dimmed but not extinguished, keeping alive the flame of empire through sacraments, sorrow, and an unbroken memory of what once was Rome. As Constantinople fell into shadow and Hagia Sophia echoed no more with the chant of the great church. Far to the north, in the frozen forests of Rus, a new fire was kindling, one that would claim the mantle abandoned by the fallen queen of cities. In Moscow, the rising principality of the Slavs, the embers of Byzantium were gathered and tended, not as relics of the past, but as the foundation of a future Rome. The claim began with a marriage. Zoe Sophia Polyologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, wed Ivan III of Moscow in 1472, her dowry not measured in gold, but in legitimacy, linking the Muscovite throne to the ancient blood of Caesar. The Kremlin absorbed Byzantine court ritual, iconography, and even titles, and from that marriage grew an ideology, Moscow as the Third Rome, the last true defender of Orthodox Christianity in a world now overrun by heresy and Islam. The first Rome had fallen to barbarism, the second to the Turks. Now Moscow stood alone as the heir of empire and faith. The czars took their name from the Latin Caesar, wrapped their palaces in Byzantine splendor, and built churches crowned with onion domes that echoed Hagia Sophia's skyward grandeur. The double-headed eagle, once soaring over Constantinople, was raised again over Russian soil, its wings stretching across a land vast, cold, and deeply orthodox. This wasn't mere imitation. It was inheritance transformed. Byzantium reinterpreted in the language of Russian mysticism, Slavic power, and holy mission. Moscow became not only a political center, but a theological beacon, fusing the Byzantine spirit with a uniquely Russian soul. The czars positioned themselves as God's anointed rulers, wielding both the sword and the cross, ruling over a sacred empire bound to divine providence. And in their churches, monks spoke of Constantinople, not as a memory, but as a warning and a legacy to fulfill. The fall of Byzantium became Russia's justification for expansion, for preservation of orthodoxy, and for the belief in Moscow's eternal role in salvation history. In this frozen land, the ghost of Byzantium did not merely linger, it was reborn, reshaped in fur, fire, and iron, carried on the backs of peasants and princes who had never seen the Bosporus, but who believed with fervent conviction that they now bore the torch of Rome itself. To the west. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was not merely a tragedy, was an opportunity, a shift in power, and a moment to claim the sacred spoils of a fallen rival. For centuries, Latin Christendom had regarded Byzantium with uneasy contempt, seeing in its theology both kinship and heresy. Yet once the city fell, the cathedrals and palaces of Europe became treasure houses of the East, lined with relics looted or bought. The horses of St. Mark pranced above the basilica in Venice. Icons adorned the altars of Rome and Paris, and manuscripts bearing the works of Plato, Aristotle, and Ptolemy passed from Greek hands into the vaults of the Renaissance. The fall of Constantinople became the spark of Western rebirth. As fleeing scholars arrived in Italy with texts, ideas, and language seeding the soil of the Renaissance with Byzantine brilliance long ignored. Yet the West did not preserve Byzantium's memory, repackaged it. To many European historians and artists, Byzantium was not a golden age, but a decadent one. Gibbon's long, dismal twilight of a once great Rome, now mired in superstition and ceremony. Its theology was labeled mystical excess, its emperors vain and effete, its bureaucracy a Byzantine maze of decay. Still, the West could not escape the allure. Gothic cathedrals borrowed from Byzantine mosaics. Legal scholars mined Justinian, Corpus Juris Civilis. Monarchs drew their coronation rituals from the grandeur of Constantinople's lost court, and in secret, in libraries and scriptoria, monks copied the words of Gregory of Nazianzus and John Chrysostom, preserving the voices of a spiritual empire they could not name without scorn. Thus, the West became both the grave robber and the reluctant heir, cradling the relics of Byzantium even as it mocked their origin, lifting from the ashes a version of the East that fit its own mirror. The legacy was not lost, it was claimed, twisted, and reimagined in Latin script and Western marble, a paradox where Byzantium lived on, not through admiration, but through appropriation, misinterpretation, and the lingering power of stolen gold. Though the empire had fallen and its emperors slain, Byzantium did not die in the hearts of the Greeks. It lived on, not as a political entity, but as a dream, a prophecy, and a wound that bled across centuries. In villages tucked into the mountains and on islands where ancient churches still stood half-buried in ivy, the people whispered stories of the marble emperor, the last Constantine, who had not died but had been turned to stone by angels, hidden beneath the golden gate of Constantinople, waiting for the moment to rise again, sword in hand, and reclaim the city for Christendom. This was no myth to them. It was faith disguised as folklore, a sacred hope smuggled past the watchful eyes of the Ottoman guards. For centuries, under Muslim rule, the Greeks remembered their lost empire in liturgy, in language, and in lament. They sang the lament for the fall of Constantinople with tears in their voices, mourning not only a city, but a universe of meaning. And when the fires of nationalism stirred in the 19th century, those memories became weapons. The Greek War of Independence, launched in 1821, was not merely about liberation from Ottoman rule. It was a cry for resurrection, an echo of Rome's ghost calling its people back to glory. Revolutionaries bore crosses alongside muskets, wrapped in the language of saints and emperors, convinced that victory might reopen the gates of the ancient city. The idea became known as the Megali idea, the great idea, a belief that modern Greece had not only the right but the destiny to restore the empire, to reclaim Constantinople, and to bring orthodoxy back to the throne of the Caesars. Though the dream would falter in the wars of the 20th century, defeated at Smyrna, broken in Asia Minor, and finally extinguished with the population exchanges of 1923, it never entirely vanished. Even now, in modern Greece, Byzantium remains a second heartbeat, pulsing beneath the surface of national identity, etched into icons, hymns, and the gold gleam of altar cloths. For the Greeks, the empire is not a ruin but a sacred inheritance, proof that though Rome fell in stone, it rose again in memory immortal, not in empire, but in yearning. Asterisk here is section 6, Rome's lost heir in the Islamic world, from your 10,000-word script for Part 8, Echoes of Empire Byzantium's World After Death, written in one seamless cinematic paragraph. To the Islamic world, Byzantium was never merely a fallen enemy, was a formidable rival, a partner in diplomacy, a symbol of imperial sophistication, and ultimately a predecessor. In early Islamic chronicles, Rum, the Arabic name for the Eastern Roman Empire, was a land of powerful emperors, intricate laws, and venerable prophets of an earlier revelation. Muslim caliphs and scholars did not erase Byzantium from memory. They recorded it, respected its administrative wisdom, and marveled at its enduring civilization. The Umayyads and Abbasids viewed the Byzantines as the standard to surpass, not just in warfare but in architecture, philosophy, and governance. When the Ottomans rose, they inherited this perspective, but with the weight of conquest added to it. Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, did not merely defeat the empire, he claimed its soul, declaring himself Kaiser-i-Ram, Caesar of the Romans, signaling to both his subjects and the world that the scepter of Rome had passed into his hands. Ottoman sultans preserved Byzantine practices, court, hierarchy, fiscal systems, and imperial ideology, not out of nostalgia, but out of recognition of their enduring utility. Even Hagia Sophia, transformed into a mosque, retained its grandeur, not only as a place of prayer, but as a monument to the imperial majesty of the past. Muslim jurists, chroniclers, and poets often portrayed the Byzantines with admiration for their discipline and laws, even while denouncing their Christian beliefs. This complex legacy carried on in Ottoman historiography, where Byzantium became the silent ancestor, its structures shaping imperial Islam from within, like the bones of an old giant buried beneath a palace. The coexistence of reverence and triumph, of conquest and continuity, became a defining feature of how Byzantium lived on in Islamic thought. It was not simply defeated, it was absorbed, its language translated, its architecture mimicked, its politics transformed into new expressions. In Istanbul's mosques, the curves of Roman domes crowned minarets that pierced the sky in testament not just to Allah, but to the unseen hands of Byzantine builders whose empire had fallen, yet whose art and order still lived. Byzantium, to the Islamic world, was not merely a relic of the past, it was a mirror of what came after, the empire that shaped its own successor long after its final breath, for centuries after its fall. Byzantium lived on, not through power, but through words, surviving in the minds of scholars, the myths of romantics, and the bitter debates of historians who could not decide whether the empire was a miracle or a mistake. In Enlightenment Europe, Byzantium suffered under the weight of Edward Gibbon's pen, condemned in the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire as a degenerate ghost obsessed with theology, riddled with superstition, ruled by and monks, a civilization that had traded virtue for ritual and fallen not to enemies, but to its own decay. Gibbon's shadow loomed long, and for generations Byzantium was remembered not for its resilience, but for its rot. Yet even as scholars scorned it, artists and poets found in Byzantium a world of wonder, a land of golden icons, veiled empresses, and lost splendor shimmering just beyond reach. W.B. Yeats dreamed of the empire in mystical verse, conjuring a Byzantium of flame and spiritual purity, while Russian philosophers saw in it the ideal synthesis of church and state, the sacred and the temporal fused into one. In the 20th century, the tide began to shift, as historians re-examined the empire's thousand-year survival, not as an embarrassment, but as an astonishing feta civilization that endured through plagues, sieges, schisms, and invasions, holding the line between East and West, antiquity and the medieval world. Scholars like George Ostrogorsky, Stephen Runciman, and Judith Herron reclaimed Byzantium from its caricature, revealing its administrative brilliance, its cultural dynamism, and its central place in the story of Europe. Universities reintroduced the study of Byzantine Greek, museums reassembled mosaics and icons, and the Internet age brought a flood of renewed interest from academic podcasts to YouTube documentaries, from Orthodox revivalists to historical fiction fanatics. Byzantium became a symbol, again, not just of lost empire, but of identity, of continuity, of the fragile thread between civilizations that rise and fall, yet echo through time. In the modern mind, Byzantium is no longer just the empire that fell, it is the empire that refused to vanish, the strange and sacred mirror through which we glimpse our own fractured world, searching for meaning in the ruins of empires long past. In the end, Byzantium is more than marble domes and fallen walls, more than vanished emperors and crumbling scrolls, is an eternal flame, a memory etched into the foundations of the modern world, flickering still in faith, in art, in dream. No other empire lasted so long or died so many times, only to rise again not in territory, but in meaning. From the basilicas of Athens to the Kremlin's golden spires, from monastic chants on Mount Athos to the solemn icons in a village chapel. In Serbia, the voice of Byzantium speaks still not in conquest, but in continuity, in the thread of spirit that connects the ancient world to the modern. It was not merely an empire of kings and walls, but an empire of vision, one that tried to reconcile heaven and earth, Caesar and Christ, Greek thought and Roman law, faith and philosophy, and in that struggle, it created something unrepeatable. Though it ended in fire and silence, Byzantium did not fall into oblivion. It passed into myth, into liturgy, into symbol. The idea of Rome, carried eastward by Constantine and transfigured by centuries of struggle and grace, did not die in 1453, changed its form, cloaking itself in Orthodox hymn, Slavic scripture, Islamic architecture, Renaissance learning, nationalist longing, and historical awe. It became a ghost, yes, but a powerful one, haunting empires, whispering through cathedrals, standing quietly in the footnotes of textbooks and the echoes of chants still sung in Greek after 1,000 years. And as long as there are people who light candles before icons, who read from scrolls once hidden from flames, who raise domes to heaven and believe that the sacred still walks among men, then Byzantium lives, not as an empire of borders and swords, but as an empire of memory, of mystery, and of meaning. Its fall was tragic, its endurance miraculous, and its afterlife unparalleled. For Byzantium is not gone, it endures, carried in the soul of a world that still remembers Rome, not only in the ruins of the West, but in the golden shadows of the East. And so, as the echoes of Byzantium fade into the hush of night, and the last candle flickers behind ancient stone, I thank you for walking with me through the shadows of empire and the fire of memory. If you're still here, eyes growing heavy, thoughts drifting with the tides of history, then know this: the story is not truly over. For as long as we remember, as long as we whisper their names and wonder what came before, the past lives on in us. If you found peace in this journey, if you felt the pulse of forgotten kings and the ache of vanished cities, then I invite you to stay. Like, share, and subscribe my channel if this tale stirred something in you, because there are more stories waiting to be told, lost worlds, silent ruins, unsung heroes, and broken empires, and I will be here, as always, to bring them back to life one dream at a time. Until then, sleep well, and may the echoes of the past guard your dreams.